Hello. So today we're going to be taking a look at the start procedure, or more specifically, we're going to be looking at three different procedures. So we're going to be looking at the before start procedure, the actual engine start procedure, and then the before taxi or after start procedure. So we're going to cover all three in this video, and yeah, let's just jump straight into it. So before we start with the before start procedure, the first thing to do would be to remove any ground equipment and close any of the aircraft's doors, and we can do that by interacting with the CDU down here. So if you followed through from the pre-flight procedure in the previous video, you would have ended up here on the takeoff ref page. So how do we get back to the simulator menu or the actions? So what you need to do is click on menu, and that will bring you back to the sim menu here. And to remove the ground equipment and close any doors, we go into FS actions, and then for the ground connections is in ground connections here, and then we want to remove the ground power and also remove the wheel chocks, and the aircraft will be okay because we've got the parking brake on, so the aircraft will be fine. And then to close any doors, we just simply go into the doors page here. By default, the only door that will be open will normally be the front left, but you may have come into this menu to open other doors. You can let's say for entry aft, so just tap on the button there, it says opening, and that would open the door at the left side at the back. And then to close it, you just tap the button again. We'll close both left side doors. Wait for confirmation. Okay, and now all of the doors on the aircraft are now closed. So once you've done that, it's usually best to just hit return, and then return to menu, and then come back to the FMC. So when you tap on FMC, that will bring you back to the last page that you're on, so it takes us straight back to the takeoff ref page there. Okay, so let's run through the before start procedure, which you can find in the FCOM 1 PDF document on page 104. So the first thing to check would be the flight deck door. You want to make sure that that's closed and locked, and that the lock fail light is off. Now in the Boeing 737, the door locking systems are not actually modelled because it's a security feature. Boeing obviously don't want everyone knowing how this door security systems work, so it's not modelled in this aircraft. But normally you just have a look back here, just make sure that neither of these lights are on here. You do have the control there, but I don't think it works at all. As I said, it's not really modelled because it is a security feature. So flight deck door is closed and locked. Next we want to check the CDU, make sure it's set to the takeoff ref page there, because we'll need to look down here to grab a little bit of information in a moment, so just make sure it's on the takeoff page there. The next step is to check the N1's reference bugs. So if you have a look on the upper display unit here, we just want to confirm that we have our D-rated takeoff selected, so we're using a D-rated, or a kind of a fixed D-rate of D-rate 2 or takeoff 2 there, and we have our N1 bugs set to 91.7 on both engines there. Okay, so now we move up to the MCP panel. So the first action up here is to arm the auto throttle, so we'll do that there. Next we change our indicated airspeed here to our V2 speed. Now if you've forgotten what it is, that's why we have our takeoff ref page down here. So you can see that our V2 speed there is 142 knots. So we'll just dial that in to the speed selection here. Next we can arm LNAV and VNAV. Now sometimes LNAV and VNAV may not arm. If you click on these buttons and the lights don't come on, it's not a problem. You just need to make a mental note that sometimes the LNAV and the VNAV will not be enabled until after you're 400 feet above ground. So sometimes you can get the lights switched on just now, depending on the airport that you're departing from and the departure procedure. However, if you're not able to select either LNAV or VNAV, if you click the button and the light just doesn't come on, then just make a mental note that you will need to turn these on shortly after takeoff to enable the autopilot to follow both the LNAV and VNAV. For those of you who don't already know, LNAV and VNAV are basically the vertical guidance and the lateral guidance that has been calculated by the flight management systems. So rather than climbing at a fixed vertical speed or at a set airspeed, it's going to climb as per the kind of the most economical climb profile that the flight management systems have calculated there. Okay, so the next bit of information we need to enter is the runway heading, or the heading of the runway that we're going to be departing from. Now, normally you can get this information off the chart for the airports that you're going to be departing from. However, sometimes if you're using out-of-date AirAct data, sometimes the charts might not match up with what the simulator thinks the runway heading is. So a convenient way I've found to overcome this is if we have a look at our CDU again, and just go down to the next page. If we have a look at the second line on the left here, we have the runway slope and the runway heading here. So you can see that the actual runway heading, as recognised by the sim, is 079 degrees there. So that's where you can find the actual runway heading as the sim thinks, or what the sim thinks the runway heading is. So what I'll do is I'll type, or kind of dial that in there, so 079 degrees, and then just come back to takeoff ref page 1, because again we'll need some more data off page 1 in a second. And then the final bit of information we can enter up here on the MCP panel is the altitude. So depending on whether you're flying with air traffic control or not, usually air traffic control will give you an initial altitude to climb to during your clearance delivery, so that's when they also give you your squawk code, for example. If you're not flying with air traffic control, then the best altitude to use is the highest altitude along the departure procedure. So what you would do is you'd set the altitude as per ATC instruction or as per the departure chart. So if you think back to the departure chart that we used for Gatwick for the LAM 5P departure, the highest altitude that we're going to be reaching along the departure is going to be 6,000 feet. So that's what I've set the altitude to there. Okay, and with that, the next step is actually to conduct a taxi and takeoff briefing. Now, I'm not sure of the official format, but in real life, normally pilots would take a couple of minutes now to discuss the taxi and the takeoff procedures. So they would consider where they're parked at the airport, they would consider which runway they're going to be departing from, and they would consider what the most likely taxi route is going to be. They'd also talk about the departure procedure, so the captain would give instructions about what to do in the event of an aborted takeoff, and things like that. They'll just confirm and cross-check and double-check each other's work, make sure that everyone's on the same page, so to speak. So make sure that they both know exactly which runway they're taking off from, what the departure procedure is going to be, what's going to be involved during the departure procedure, and things like that. Because I'm only a single sim pilot, I'm not really going to do an official taxi and takeoff briefing, but just be aware that this is kind of at this point of the kind of pre-flight procedures. This is when pilots would normally do it. Anyway, moving on, the next thing to check would be the exterior doors. So you want to just double check all of those and make sure they are all closed. The best way to do that is to have a look at the door annunciator here, just underneath the hydraulic pump panel. Make sure that all of these lights are out. All of these lights indicate various doors on the aircraft. You just want to make sure all of these lights are out. And then the final thing to check is the flight deck windows. So you want to make sure that those are both closed and locked. And I don't believe in the PMDG that it's possible to open them at all, so you can just kind of take that as a given that they are closed and locked. Also at this point, if it's dark outside and if you've chosen to use the lights, now would also be a good time to turn off the wing and wheel well lights. As I said, you can turn those on or off as you see fit, but at this point it would be a good time to turn those off if you are using them. And also, at this point, now would be the perfect time to contact air traffic control for your pushback and your start clearance, because those are the next couple of steps. Is we're going to start pushing back now away from the gate to get away from the building, and also request permission to start our engines. So if you are flying with air traffic control, now would be a good time to do that. Okay, so once you have clearance from air traffic control, we can do the last couple of actions and then we can begin our pushback. So the first thing to consider is whether you have fuel in your center fuel tank. So if you have a look here, we can see that we have fuel on our left and right sides, but nothing in our center tank. So it's not a consideration for this flight. But if you have over 1,000 pounds or 460 kilograms of fuel in your center tank, then you would need to turn on your center tank fuel pumps. You need to turn those on. So we come back to the overhead panel here. So you would turn these two fuel pumps on if you had fuel in your center tank, essentially. Regardless of that, at this point now you can turn on the left and right fuel tank pumps, so all of these can come on. You can also turn on the electric hydraulic switches, so the two central switches here on the hydraulic pumps panel, those can both go on, and the low pressure lights should go out. So coming back to the central display units, what you want to do is check the system page and make sure that your pressure is around about 2,800 psi in both A and B systems. You also want to have a look over on the first officer side, check the brake pressure gauge here and make sure that it's around the 2,800 psi mark, or around the sort of the 2.8 mark on this little gauge here. The next action we can do is to turn on the anti-collision light, so that's the red beacon light above and below the fuselage of the aircraft. That just warns ground crews not to approach the aircraft because we're about to start our engines. After turning on the anti-collision lights, what we can do now is set the trim for takeoff. So again, we can have a look at the takeoff ref page here, and we have this trim value next to the center of gravity. So the trim value here is 5.02, so what we're going to do is set that here on the trim wheel. Now it can be difficult to get the exact value here, so what I personally do is I have the tooltips enabled in FSX. So if I hover my mouse over the trim wheel, hopefully there you can see the tooltip which says elevator trim, and then it says 4.26. So what I'm going to do is just roll the trim back until it gets to about 5.02. Now it doesn't have to be precisely 5.02, as long as you're within 0.05 units, that should be okay for takeoff there. It doesn't have to be absolutely precise. It can be difficult there, and sometimes when you move the wheel you do get some errant readings, but here we've got 5.16, so I'm going to dial it down to about 5.03, and that's perfect. You know, I can happily use that. That's not really going to affect the handling of the aircraft during the takeoff too much. As I said, as long as you're within 0.05 units, you should be okay there. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. And then the final thing to check would be the rudder and aileron trim. So we can check the aileron trim here on the yoke. We can see that that's currently set to 0, which is fine. And if we have a look back here on the center pedestal, we've got the rudder trim there as well, which is set to 0, and both the controls for the rudder trim and the aileron trim there. So we don't need to readjust the trim for those systems. That's all okay there. Okay, so once we've checked those final things, now we can move into the before start checklist. So you can find the before start checklist in the QRH PDF documents, and you'll find that on page 25. So the checklist reads: flight deck door closed and locked. As I said earlier, it's not really modelled in this aircraft, so we don't really need to worry about it. Fuel, we just want to double check our total fuel on board, make sure that we have enough for the flight, and it's what we had in our kind of flight plan initially. So 14,600 pounds of fuel, that's correct there. Next, we want to double check the passenger signs, and we want to have that set to either auto or on. As I said in the previous video, for takeoff I like to have the passenger signs explicitly set to on for takeoff, and then during the flight I'll set them down to auto. Next step is to check the windows. Again, I don't think it's possible to open the windows or the flight deck windows in the PMDG, so you can take that as a given that they are locked. Next, we want to check the MCP panel, so we want to check our V2 speed, which is 142. We want to check the runway heading, which is 079, and our kind of initial altitude is 6,000 feet as per the departure charts there. Again, that might be a different altitude if air traffic control have given you a different clearance altitude there. Next step is the CDU pre-flight. So both pilots would just confirm that all of the data, both navigation and performance data, has been entered into the CDUs earlier on in the pre-flight setup, which it has been. Rudder and aileron trim, we checked a moment ago, is 0 on both. Taxi and takeoff briefing, again, something more applicable to real life, but as a single pilot simmer, you may not need to do that, but it's a kind of a real life step that's included there. So if the pilots have had that discussion about the taxi and takeoff procedures, they would kind of check that off and say that's been completed. And we also check to make sure that the anti-collision light is on, so just look up, double check, anti-collision light there is on. Okay, and now we are ready to start our engines. Now, before we do that, if you are at a busy airport where you would need to push back away from the terminal, now would be the time to start the pushback. Now, in the PMDG, there is a little pushback function which can be accessed down here via the CDU. So, if we come back to the menu page, that brings us back to our kind of main sim menu on the CDU here. If we go into FS Actions, and then Pushback, now we can enter in a little bit of information here to begin a pushback. So what you need to do here is you need to kind of figure out the settings for yourself, and it's not really an exact science, but basically some of the information that you can enter in here is the straight length. So what this will do is this will push the plane back this amount of distance before it begins to turn the aircraft, if you're turning the aircraft during its pushback. But the line below that will calculate the total amount of distance, so that will account for how much distance you're pushing back in a straight line before it begins to turn. It'll also include the amounts of distance covered in the turn as well. Here we have a line which says you can turn the nose to the left or the right. Now we'll actually be turning to the left, or we'll need to be pointing to the left after we push back, so I'm going to change that there, and going to be pushing back 90 degrees. So if I just go outside and have a look here, so we need to push back a little bit of a way, and the taxi line is actually back here. So I've had a few kind of attempts at this before, so I kind of have an idea of how much distance I need to push back. So I think it's going to be about 65 feet pushing back in a straight line before it begins to turn the aircraft. So once you, again, it's kind of a bit of trial and error here to get it just right. Sometimes you may push back and you may find yourself, on the grass, kind of way behind the aircraft and all sorts. But generally, if you push back maybe 20 to 60 feet in a straight line and then begin a turn, that's a half decent rule of thumb there. That should kind of cover off most problems there. But anyway, we're ready to start pushing back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the start button here, and what you're going to do is you're going to hear some audio and a couple of prompts from, so kind of like a built-in kind of voiceover or audio in the sim. So I'm going to hit the start button, and we're just going to simply push back and follow those prompts.
And ground cockpit.
All right, Captain.
We're all set to go up here. We've been cleared to push and start at your discretion.
Roger that, ready for push. Power and air clear, doors closed, we are ready for pushback. Please parking brake, please.
Okay, so there was an instruction there from our kind of virtual ground crew who asked us to release the parking brake, so we're going to do that.
Okay, parking brake is on, clear to push.
There's going to be a little pause, and then the pushback will start.
Brakes off, here we go.
Okay, so now you can see that the aircraft is now starting to move backwards. So what will happen is we'll be pushed back for 65 feet in a straight line, and then you'll notice that the aircraft will start to turn automatically after that. And of course, if you want to stop the pushback at any point, there is a sort of a shortcut there. You just hit the button next to stop, and it will just immediately stop the pushback. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the sim push the aircraft back onto the main taxiway, and then we'll talk about the engine start procedure once the pushback is completed. Alternatively, if you are at an airport which doesn't normally do pushbacks, you can kind of forget about this whole pushback procedure, and you can just do a standing start where the aircraft is parked, and then you can just taxi off the apron after that. For example, at Inverness Airport, where we're flying to in this series of videos, they don't have any pushback ability there. There's no tugs or anything that can push an aircraft. So at Inverness Airport, it's just a standing start on an apron. So if you're doing that, you can just skip that step, and we'll go straight into the engine start procedure after this. And I think I've just missed the centre line in the taxiway there. Not a massive deal, as I said, it is a bit of trial and error sometimes. But yeah, we're almost on the taxiway line there. Alternatively, if you have like a ground crew add-on, like I think GSX is a popular one, then you could use that as well. That might be a bit more accurate. So the ground crew just said the pushback is complete, set the parking brake, so we'll do that.
Alright, brakes are set and pressure's normal.
Okay, sir, tow bar is on, pin is out, watch the pin on the right.
Alright guys, thanks. You're cleared to disconnect. We will be watching for the pin and the release from guidance on the right side of the airplane, and we'll see you guys next time through.
Roger that, have a good flight.
Okay, so normally at this point the pilots would be looking out for the ground crew there, just to make sure that the ground crew are, have driven away from the front of the aircraft or clear of the aircraft. The PMDG doesn't have any kind of external modelling. There was no like tug that drove up and pushed us away, so we don't need to look out for anyone near the aircraft. It's all just kind of from a cockpit perspective. It's all just voiceover stuff, and actions in the sim. There's no actual kind of models to look out for after the pushback there. So now we move into the engine start procedure, which you can find in the FCOM 1 manual on page 108. So the first thing we need to do is change the lower display units down here. What we want to do is just tap on the engine button just to bring up the secondary engine page down here. Next, what we want to do is go over to the air conditioning panel and turn off both packs. What this does is this just allows all of the bleed air that the APU is generating to go into the engine to get the engine start spinning before it actually starts. And then the final thing we need to do is we need to call out the start sequence. So generally pilots will start engine 2 first and then engine 1. The reason being that as we started the APU, it's been taking a little bit of fuel out of the left hand wing, or the left wing or the left fuel tank. So by starting the right engine first, what we're going to do is we're going to start burning fuel out of the right fuel tank, and then that's just going to even up the numbers ever so slightly. Again, it's just to help like balance the aircraft a little bit. That's one reason why pilots would start the right side engine first, or the number 2 engine first. So what we're going to do is start engine 2 and then engine 1. Okay, so what I've done here is I've just changed the view, and there's actually 3 different views that you can see on the screen just now. Up in the top left, what we've got is a view of the engine and spar valve lights here. So what's going to happen is once we flick the engine start lever, which are these 2 levers here, once we move those into the idle position, what that's going to do is that's going to tell onboard systems in the aircraft to open up these fuel valves, which will allow fuel from the fuel tanks into the engines, and then that will start fuel flowing into the engine, and then the engine can then use fuel to start a self-sustaining reaction, and the engine will accelerate up to an idle speed. So once we move these levers during the start process, you'll see that these lights will go brighter to indicate that the valves are moving, and then they'll go out to indicate that the valves are now open. Over in the top right, what you can see are the engine start switches here. So what you're going to see happen is you're going to see me move the starter switches into the ground position, and that's going to initiate the start process. So that's going to start changing valves within the the bleed air system, and that's going to start redirecting bleed air from the APU into the engine to start it spinning, to get it up to that speed where we can now introduce fuel into the engine. And then what you can see sort of in the main view here is going to be the display units here. So as the engine starts procedure progresses, I'm going to call out what I'm looking for, some of the indications that we're going to see, and also some of the things that you should see when you're starting the engine yourself. So the first thing we need to do is move the engine start switch to the ground position. So I can only do that from this main view here. So we're going to go to engine 2 first. We're going to move that over to ground. So we should get an indication saying start valve open, and we should start to see the N2 percentage on the second engine increase. Now what we're looking for is we're looking for this N2 percentage to reach 25. Once it does, then we're going to move the engine start lever for engine 2. So that's 23, 24, 25. We get the engine valve lights are moving there. We can see here that we start getting some fuel flowing into the engine. Now as the fuel starts to flow into the engine, what we're looking for is we're looking for the exhaust gas temperature to increase, the low oil pressure lights to go out. I'm also looking for the N1 percentage to start increasing as well. We're also going to keep an eye on here on the oil pressure and oil temperature, make sure those are increasing. Now next, the N2, once it reaches 56, the starter switch will pop out into its either auto or off position there. And then if you have a look up here on the upper display unit, the start valve open lights will also go off as well. So those are some of the main indications and things that you're looking for during an engine start procedure. Also, you just want to make sure that like all of the engine parameters now just start increasing slowly up to their idle speed. So what we're going to do now is we're going to repeat that process for engine 1. So just go up here because I can only control the switches from here. So we'll move the engine 1 switch to the ground position there. We get start valve open lights. We start seeing some movement on the N2 there. So again, once we get to 25 on the N2, we're going to move the start lever, and then we'll see these the fuel valves will open. So 24, 25, lights bright to show they're moving, lights out. Fuel flow is active, so we've got fuel going into the engine. EGT is increasing, N1 is increasing. Low oil pressure light goes out. Oil pressure, oil temperature is now alive and increasing slowly. And then watching the N2 at 56, the starter switch will pop out of the ground position and into the off position. And we lose the start valve open light there as well. So those are the engine start, well that's the engine start procedure. What we're looking for is we're looking for the engines to be sitting at around 20% on the N1, around about 400 on the exhaust gas temperature, and around about 60 on the N2 there. The numbers don't have to be perfect because obviously if you're flying in a hotter climate, the exhaust gas temperature will just kind of naturally be higher due to the higher temperature outside. If you're flying in a colder climate, you know, the temperature might be below 350, again just because of the climate that the aircraft is in. But in general, you're looking for 2460 here. Okay, so now that we've got the engine started, what we need to do now is the before taxi procedure, which can be found in the FCOM 1 manual on page 110. So what the before taxi procedure is going to involve is just reconfiguring the aircraft and just doing the final few steps to get it ready for takeoff. So the first thing we're going to do is turn on the generator switches 1 and 2. So if we click generator 1, generator 2, the gen off bus lights should go off and the APU gen off bus light should come on. So what we've just done there is transfer the electrical supply from the APU generators onto the engine generators. So now the engines are providing electrical power to the aircraft. Next, we can turn the probe heat switches on and all of the lights should go off. The wing and the engine anti-ice, if you need those, you can turn those on at this point. We don't need it for this flight, so I'm going to leave those off. The packs, we can turn those back on, so we just turn left and right back into the auto position there. The isolation valve in the middle, we just right click on that and push that back into the auto position now. The APU bleed air switch can now be turned off, and the dual bleed light should go off. Next we come down to the APU master switch. Now that we don't need the APU anymore, we can turn the APU off by right clicking and pushing the switch into the off position. Now, if the aircraft has a particular type of ignition system, we now need to move the engine start switches over to the continuous position here. In this aircraft, we do have the option there. In other aircraft, it might have a different ignition system. If that's the case, then you just leave the ignition system in the auto position. Coming back to the center pedestal, we just want to confirm that the engine start levers are both secure in the idle position. If we have a very close look here, you can see that there's actually a little notch there, so pilots would just make sure that the start levers are secure in the idle little detents there, little position. Now we can set the flaps for takeoff, so we're going to be using flaps 5, so we're going to move the flaps 3 positions there, and you'll see that the flaps indicator will also start to move. Next we need to do a flight control check. Now in this aircraft we're quite lucky. If we click on the system page here, you can see that we have these lines which represent the position of various flight control surfaces on the aircraft. So what I'm going to do is just pull through the 3 main control axes. So I'm going to pull back to test pitch control. I'm going to roll left and right, and then I'm going to move the rudder to the left and right, or the yaw axis there. Now if you don't have these indications in the cockpit, it's not a problem. Pilots will still do this flight control check. Basically what you want to make sure is that your flight controls can be moved through their full range of movement, and then when you release pressure on the controls, that the controls return back to their central position. So the flight control has been checked. Now what we want to do is just blank out the lower display unit here. So what I personally like to do is I like to have the secondary engine indications in their condensed format below the main engine indications there. But at this point you want to have the lower display unit blanked there. I'm not sure if this is something that real world pilots would do. Again, it might be airline specific. Some may tell their pilots to have their screen set up like this for takeoff. Others may have it set up like that. Next we can now activate the transponder. Now you would only turn the transponder to an active mode if the airport that you're flying at has a ground radar tracking. A ground radar tracking system, sorry. Because we're at Gatwick, that is a large airport and they do have ground radar, so what I'm going to do is turn the transponder here onto alt repeating off. So what that will do is make the aircraft visible to air traffic control. The aircraft will show up as a little blip on air traffic control screens. However, it's not giving any altitude information. Because we're on the ground at an airport, we don't need to give air traffic control altitude information. If the airport that you're flying at does not have any ground radar tracking, then just leave the transponder on standby for the time being. Once we get to the runway, we'll turn the transponder on, but for taxiing you want it to be either on standby or alt repeating off. And then finally, the last thing to do is to do an annunciator recall. So we can do that by pressing on the annunciator panel here, and then if we release the button, there should be no lights will stay on. And also don't forget that there's an annunciator panel on both sides of the aircraft, so don't forget to check both screens to make sure that there's no annunciators stay on there. We've released the button, nothing has stayed on, so we're good to go. Okay, so once the procedure has been completed, next step is to run through the before taxi checklist. So that's what I'm going to do just now. So first we have to check the generators. We just confirm that those are both on there. Next we check the probe heat again, just to confirm that is on. The anti-ice we are not going to use for this flight, so we just confirm that that is off. The isolation valve over on the air conditioning panel, make sure that is in auto. The engine start switches, The engine start switches down here without the automatic ignition system are both in the continuous position. Come back to the virtual cockpit view here. The next step is to check the recall, which is what we did at the end of the procedure there, so just make sure there's no outstanding issues. After that, we check the auto brake, make sure that's in the RTO position. Double check the engine start levers, confirm that they are secure in the idle position. We've also checked the controls, the flight controls there, we've pulled that through each axis of movement. And ground equipment in real life, pilots would check to make sure that the ground equipment is clear of the aircraft. Okay, so the final step that I'm going to cover in this video is the taxi. So now that we've got the aircraft configured for flight and we're almost ready to go, now we can begin taxiing. So at this point, now would be a good time to contact air traffic control for taxi clearance. Once you have been given your taxi route and your taxi clearance by air traffic control, you can turn on the taxi lights, release the parking brake, and then start taxiing over to your departure runway. Now, I've found in this aircraft that a good taxiing power is to set the N1 here to about 23 on the N1. Now, it's going to be a bit tricky for me to do with my my joystick controller here, but I've found that having the N1 set to about 23 is a good compromise between getting the aircraft rolling slowly, but not having the aircraft accelerating too quickly or decelerating. So you can see I've got 24 there just to get it moving. Just going to try and pull it back a tiny bit. As I said, it's quite difficult for me with the joystick and the throttle control that I have here. But I put through my experience, I found 23 is a good percentage there. Okay, and now that we are taxiing, I'm actually going to end the video there. So in the next video, we're going to look at the before takeoff procedure, which is actually very, very quick. And then we're also going to look at the actual takeoff and climb procedures. So until then, thank you all very much for watching. Take care out there, and I will catch you all later.